and thanks for joining this session on Main Street architecture. As many of you know, and as Carol said, I'm Sarah Lemke, and I'm the Main Street, Iowa Downtown Building Rehabilitation Specialist. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the basics of historic commercial architecture, specifically on Main Street, and about how to gain a better understanding of the buildings that you have within your district. And I just want to say before we begin that the intent of this webinar is not to make anyone an architectural expert, but really to give you enough information to make you dangerous. It is important for you to be confident in your knowledge so that you can be an effective liaison between local building owners and others who are involved in building rehabilitation projects. And my advice to you as you listen to this webinar is whether or not you're a brand new director or a board member or have 10 plus years of experience on Main Street, is just to think about where you are in the process of learning about your district's architecture and then work to elevate your understanding to that next level to really become a stronger leader. And so in regards to the built environment, your job as a Main Street leader is to be an advocate for your district through the lens of historic preservation. That preservation focus is a key principle of the Main Street approach, and it's what sets it apart from other economic development programs. Essentially, in order to do your job, you really need to know what questions to ask and who to direct them to. A great way to start is by building your architectural vocabulary, and then get to know your downtown buildings, their character, materials, building styles, know the basics of building maintenance as well, and also what the best practices are for rehabilitation projects. And these are really the core concepts behind Main Street architectural knowledge, or as I like to say, it's the Main Street Architecture 101 if this was a course. So I'll spend the majority of the time focusing on these for today, and then I'll give you a brief overview of the other things, which include those local resources that you have, your local authorities having jurisdiction, the resources that are available through Main Street, Iowa, and then a few other important reminders about the role of your design committee and how to work with them. So starting with building terminology, this is probably the single most important thing to come away with today, is really a good understanding of architectural terminology. Because if you aren't sure what to call something when you're talking to a building owner or anyone else in your community, you're going to have a hard time getting through that conversation without knowing what these terms are. This slide shows the glossary that is included at the appendix of the Iowa Downtown Design Guide. And it's really a great sheet to have on hand as you're doing your street time so that you can quickly refer to something if you need to. And although each building is very different, there are some basic elements that most historic commercial buildings have. The main parts of these are the storefront at the bottom, the upper stories or upper story above that, and then at the very top, the cornice and the parapet. And I'll go through all of these terms in more detail as we go along. Here's a little bit of a closer view of the storefront area. It begins with the secondary cornice or the lintel at the top in green, and it goes down to the curb at the bottom where we have our bulkhead. As you can see, these are all the different elements that are directly street facing in the traditional commercial buildings on Main Street. So the storefront opening, this is a very important concept just to keep in mind. It's important to know that there are boundaries, or there should be boundaries to a storefront, and the elements should completely fill the boundaries of that opening. The storefront spans from column to column or pier to pier on the horizontal direction, and then from the cornice or the steel lintel at the top, all the way down to the bulkhead or the curb, the sidewalk at the bottom. And as we go through each of the terms, I just want to mention I'm going to have a little diagram in the upper left-hand corner, so be sure to take a look at that to know what to focus on as I'm going through the photo examples. And as I mentioned, the top of the storefront is the lower cornice or the steel lintel. A lintel is the term for the actual structural portion that holds up the brickwork above the storefront and allows the structure to span over all of the windows between the columns. And many times the steel or sometimes iron lintel is exposed, as you can see on the two images on the right. And the lintels, if they are exposed, they typically are riveted along their length, and many have little rosette details at the fasteners, as you can see in the detail in the upper right-hand corner. It's also important to know that many of these that have exposed steel lintels do have steel or iron columns as a mid-span between the lintels as additional support. And they also become a decorative element to the storefront. And the term lower cornice refers to the non-structural decorative element that you can see over on the left photo that's there. And these are typically constructed out of wood or metal, although for some restoration of missing cornices, there are some really good fiberglass options that are now available. Display windows. Display windows are the large primary windows at the street level that really give you that classic historic commercial appearance that we all know sets our main streets apart from other shopping areas. Their primary purpose is to display product and to create interest for businesses. And what we want to do is have those full windows that really lure the customer off the street and into the store. So when we think about restoration or rehabilitation projects, getting these windows right is really critical to the entire proportions of the building, and the display windows and the frames should be appropriate for what is there. The examples shown here have thinner elements for the frames because they're made of metal. But there's also, it's very common to see thicker frames that are constructed of wood or have a combination of wood with those iron columns. And this is another example of metal frames. These are aluminum frames which have a very minimal appearance to them, and they are also lighter in color and have that light finish throughout. Transom windows are also part of the storefront assembly as well, and most times they have the same framing system as the rest of the storefront itself. The example on the left is a more modern wood storefront with transom windows, and the example on the right is historic prism glass, which is a character-defining feature of a building that should definitely be retained if they're still intact. This is becoming more and more uncommon to see these completely intact. So if you have those are pretty special. I've shown on the right image a view from the interior to just kind of remind everyone that this is why we have transom windows. Transom windows are to let extra light into the interior and really create a special feeling for the front retail space. The term transom window not only refers to those windows that we think of as the windows that are above the display windows, but they also refer to any glass that is above doors. So the photo on the left shows a double transom above the doors, and there are two transom windows here so that the frames over the display windows align all the way across horizontally and continue into that recessed door area. But transoms can also be operable, as you can see on the right, although this is not as common in Iowa. And again, if you have them, these are very special to retain. And here are a few more images of transoms. This is kind of just to show you, I already pointed out the prism glass, which is actually small pieces of glass that are within the larger panes of glass. But also when you have the traditional size, large panes of glass, sometimes we see that they're frosted or patterned as well, as the picture shows on the right. The bulkhead area, or sometimes it's called a kick plate, is the area beneath the display windows that goes all the way to the curb or the sidewalk itself. And these are called kick plates sometimes, mostly when they are modern examples of storefronts. And so the slightly taller and more ornate ones we usually refer to as bulkheads. And they're often constructed of wood, having primarily rectangular detailing and trim. And the inset rectangular panels and trim are sometimes painted different colors to go with the entire color scheme and to really stand out with the other elements of the storefront. Bulkheads can also have dimensional metal panels, or they can be very, very simple brick elements. But some bulkheads are covered in ceramic tile. These can be in many colors, although most often we see a lot of neutrals within the ceramic tiles on bulkheads. And the tiles are often at least 3 by 3 inches, if not larger. 4 by 4 is very common. And these are typically larger than those historic mosaic tiles that we tend to see on the recessed entry areas, as you can see on the photos in the left and bottom right, how they have the mosaic in the recess area. And as I mentioned, primary entrances are often recessed from the front plane of the storefront, which offers not only a little bit of weather covering over the door, but it also leaves additional room for the door to swing outward towards the street without actually encroaching into the street itself. And it provides a visual transition and really defines the commercial entrance, letting people know where they should enter. And historically, there were many storefront configurations that had double doors, but today for accessibility, a lot of them are being converted into one single larger door with a side light on one side or two, depending on how wide that opening is. And you can see an example of one that's been retrofitted in the middle. Doors can be varnished or stained, painted wood, and then a lot of times with those aluminum storefront systems, we just see a plain aluminum door. And although I said that most of them have centrally located entrances, some mid-century and later storefronts were constructed in many different configurations. The examples that are shown all the way on the left is that the storefront is completely angled with a side entrance on the storefront with a small width in the upper right. And then there is a door that is really recessed in the lower right due to the configuration of that storefront, which is more of a jewel box configuration that really came into popularity 20s, 30s, 40s. Secondary entrances are off to one side of the storefront windows and typically lead to the stairs that go to the upper stories. These are often not recessed out so that you know that it's not part of that same storefront. They're also differentiated in many different ways. As you can see on the photograph on the left here, that entrance is actually separated from the storefront with a full width pier. And then it is differentiated a little bit by having regular glass on the side transom window. And the one on the right, the door is a little bit more integrated into the entire storefront area, but it is differentiated by its single width. All of the other doors, that the commercial entrances, are double doors, and then that one's off to the side with a single door. The upper facade is typically just the second story on the buildings here in Iowa, but some of our districts do have 3- and 4-story buildings. So when we refer to the upper facade, it's really that second story and up. But the main feature of the upper stories is the operable windows. This is the most important thing to get right if we are going to choose one thing to just nail. The windows themselves were traditionally single or double hung windows, meaning that they have 2 portions or 2 sashes. And in a single hung window, which is the most common that we see today, that lower portion slides up. So the lower sash slides up to open the window. And windows can have a different number of individual panes, or as we refer to them, different lights. So a 2/2 window is divided into 2 pieces of glass at the top sash and 2 pieces of glass at the bottom. And upper windows can also have full arched openings or flat arch openings, but regardless of the shape, something to remember is that each window unit should entirely fill the opening. Window hoods are another really important feature of the upper facade. And window hoods are those decorative portions that project out above the window openings. And they can be made out of stone, wood, metal, or sometimes they're just made out of bricks that project outwards. And it's important to note, though, that not all windows have defined hoods. Instead, some have flat brickwork. And actually, on this last slide here, you can see a variation of that more flat brickwork that still adds a decorative detail over those windows. And windowsills. So most of you are probably familiar with this term, but often we're thinking about a windowsill because we're thinking of setting something down on the windowsill on the interior side of the building. Windowsills on the exterior are still called windowsills, but instead of being covered in wood, as is common on the interior, most are made of stone, concrete, or brick. And exterior windowsills, it's really important to remember that they should always slope downwards away from the window itself. And this is so that water can drain effectively away from the opening, and you don't have any water or snow pooling and collecting and then going inside of the building. And as you can see in the photos, some windowsills span one window alone, while others span between several windows. And some are even incorporated into the decorative banding that goes all the way the facades. Parapets is one that might not be as commonly thought of. Generally we know cornices, but parapets are actually the structure itself that is behind those cornices. And often you can't see them from the front of the building, which is how they often get overlooked, but they're really important in terms of how the building is constructed. Parapets are, they have a cap that is either metal, terracotta, or stone, and this caps the top of the wall so that water doesn't go into the top of the masonry and cause damage to the structure. And the roof is also terminated at the back side of the parapet and goes horizontally, excuse me, and goes horizontally up the parapet just a bit to provide kind of that smooth transition between where the horizontal flat roofing material ends and to where the horizontal wall begins. That really works to keep the water out of your building. And cornices. So this is what is the decorative portion that is facing the street side of the parapet. We already went over lower cornices, and it's important to note that most often the lower cornices are smaller in scale and are less ornate, and then the upper cornices are generally larger and more ornate. And the reason for this is that they serve as really a visual cap to the building and differentiate each building as you're going down the block. However, some cornices are still very simple, Here you can see a few examples of metal, wood, terracotta, and stone cornices. Um, and there's also the more simpler cornices tend to be brick that is projecting out at different depths. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there are other things that you should be aware of that are on your buildings. And this is really a case of looking at the buildings that you have within your district. If you see something, look up that particular item and try to figure out what that is called, because really these vary. But we see a couple examples here that just has some more ornate brickwork on the left side. And then on the right side, there's some ceramic tile that's at the top, and also some plaques and decorative inlays. And as far as the interiors are concerned, there are a few elements that are really important on that. And I think most of you are probably aware of these. The most obvious is probably tin ceilings or metal ceilings, which are typically the most notable feature that really bring your eye up and create some texture within those tall first floor spaces. Also be aware of types of flooring, which might be historic, such as wood floors and ceramic tile flooring. We often see historic tile floors that are outfitted with mosaic tiles that display an original emblem or initials of either the builder of the building or the first original business that occupied that space. Safes are another common feature that we see in historic interiors. So those large, heavy metal doors, and also sometimes we see fire doors that are another feature to look out for and to retain within your historic interiors. And on the upper stories, be aware of woodwork around windows and doors and trim that are character defining features that should be retained. And lastly, skylights are a very, very important feature, not just for the aesthetics of the element itself, but it's also important because of the light that they bring into the center of spaces, which mid-block buildings are often really limited in the amount of windows that they have on the side walls. And so they really rely, especially in those narrow and deep buildings, they rely heavily on using that light from the skylights. So that was all I had for an overview of the architectural terms. But it isn't really enough just to know what those terms are alone. The important thing is that you're able to apply them to the buildings that are within your district. So get to know your downtown, understand what you have, how it has changed over time, and familiarize yourself with things like building inventories and the historical information that you have on when these buildings were built. And if your district is listed on the National Register, this is a really, really great place to start. Most of the groundwork has already been collected in a centralized place for you. So be sure to read those through for things like important dates, architectural styles, and features that they specifically call out within your district. And also just look in your files. A lot of main streets keep historical photographs. And if you don't have those, this would be the time, reach out to your local historical society, have a discussion with them, because you'll be surprised sometimes at how much other information the historical society has about your district. And also work in general to just understand building styles and materials that are dominant within your district, and what time periods are significant within your district. It's worth recognizing and reminding everyone that although people tend to be drawn to the more traditional commercial buildings, which were built in the late 19th and early 20th century, but there are more modern styles that really just have their own unique characteristics and are just important into telling the story of how your downtowns have evolved over time. We want to make sure that main streets tell the true story of your town, and not create one theme or specific period for all downtown buildings, but they work with what is there in the existing building and work to celebrate and play up those existing features. And along with that idea too, it's really important to recognize that many of the downtowns have architecture that is not just what we think of as a traditional Main Street building. Many of our districts have residences that have been converted into commercial spaces, and many have single-story buildings, and then buildings that might have several different areas that have main entrances for different retail spaces as well. But this one is also really, really important to remember. Building maintenance. Every building needs continuous care um, to keep it in working order and to keep it functioning and to protect the structure. Building owners really tend to overlook certain maintenance items, or they push them off thinking, well, if it's been this way for 20 years, uh, it can go another winter. But really putting these things off and focusing on things like signage and interior needs can do harm to your buildings and can really cause some problems for your district as a whole long term. Uh, we suggest that every building envelope is inspected routinely, and really this should be at minimum yearly, but ideally every time that the seasons change, every first big rainfall, when the snow melts, things like that, that's a great time to walk around the building and take a look at all the exterior to make sure things are working as they should. The most important part of building maintenance that is overlooked is keeping a good roof structure together and making sure that it is watertight. Without roofs that keep out water, everything in the building is at risk. And if this goes on for a period of time, it can lead to catastrophic structural damage within one building that then has a trickle effect through other buildings on that block. And roofs on traditional commercial buildings that dominate our main streets are those flat roofs. Although they were historically ballasted roof systems or roofing materials with small rocks on top, uh, the predominant roofing materials that we see today are EPDM or rubber roofing, and then PVC is also an option that also works. But we want to avoid spray foam roofing. I've seen this a lot recently. But spray foam roofing is hard to remove, and if it's not applied properly, which most of the time it's not, it can actually hide water problems, and then it can also create a really lumpy, snow-like looking appearance that makes it hard for water to drain appropriately. And during the installation of spray foam roofing, overspray is really hard to control, and you can end up spraying the spray foam on adjacent buildings or parts of that building that you really don't want it to be on. But another really important thing to think about is the maintenance of masonry. Mortar must be kept in good condition to keep the brick or stone in good condition. Mortar is considered the sacrificial element of a masonry wall. So in other words, it should be the first thing to deteriorate, and it should be continuously addressed on a routine basis to make sure that those bricks or stone are really protected. So as the sacrificial element, when new mortar is applied, it should be soft and lime-based mortar that is softer than the bricks or the stone themselves. And that way, anytime that you have damage happening to a wall, the cracking appears first in the mortar and doesn't actually crack through the bricks themselves. Another basic concept concerning exterior masonry walls is that they should always be repaired rather than covered up. Many building owners think that they should cut corners and save money by putting siding, stucco, or even parge coats over entire walls. But in actuality, the walls still continue to deteriorate behind that new material. And the new material actually opens it up and makes it more susceptible to trap additional moisture into walls that are already in poor condition. Other commonly overlooked maintenance items include sealant, which is one thing that most people often forget until they are experiencing issues from deferred maintenance of that sealant. Sealant should be applied regularly, and whenever it appears to be cracked, it has shrunk, or is compromised in any way, it's a good idea to reapply that, especially, as I said earlier, as the seasons change and the temperature raises and dips. That's a really great time to be checking those. Check around all openings such as windows and doors, but don't forget control joints and movement joints as well. And also remember to replace weather stripping and glazing putty on your openings as necessary. And then always inspect concealed spaces such as attics, unused upper stories, and make sure you're getting into those regularly to make sure that there are no leaks or other hazards that you won't know about until it becomes a problem in your occupied spaces. And knowing the difference between a good and a bad rehab will get you a long way. Good building projects retain character defining features and the historic characteristics of the building that still exist. As I mentioned, fix things and don't just cover them up, which will create more problems down the road. And don't paint brick that is not already painted, because this can actually cause the brick's long-term damage by trapping moisture within the wall that then cannot get out because of that additional paint. And use color wisely, and try to limit paint schemes to 3 or 4 colors, and use most of the color on removable elements of the building, such as signage, instead of the building itself. On awning is also a great way to add color without doing something that will be really hard to be reversible if the building changes hands or if they have a new tenant come into this space. And lastly, make sure that all new windows fill the entire opening and windows are not infilled with plywood or other materials. But a big part of your job is to help manage the change within your district. Development is good. We want things to be happening within your districts. And as I said before, we don't want to create that static, everything is of the same era, and it's going to be that way forever. But we want to make sure that when new construction is proposed, that you have things that are in place to ensure that the design and materials of that new construction is compatible with the existing historic buildings within your downtown. And we want to make sure that downtown friendly development is legal and encouraged. And many ordinances were put in place decades ago, and now we have different opinions about some of those things, like projecting signage used to not be allowed in a lot of places, but now we really encourage that. And sidewalk merchandising, things like sandwich board signs on the sidewalks, and also outdoor seating are things that we now really encourage and see as an important part as an active downtown. So in order to effectively manage that change, you're going to want to know your authorities having jurisdiction, or your AHJs. So AHJs are people that that work with zoning and ordinances. They might be your city planning, the folks who run permitting. There's also other building code inspectors, depending on where you are located. some cities have rental inspections and then fire safety inspections that are run through the fire department, and things like that. And then some have local design guidelines that are often run by heritage preservation commissions, um, and can help you in being another voice to say what materials you want to have on your main street and how to regulate signage. But also know what local resources are available to you as opposed to the regulatory um, folks. Some of these that are listed here may actually be able to help you with funding, and have their own local incentive programs, whether that is grants or low interest loans. But it's just really important to know what those resources are, because they are available to you as partners in preservation, as some other opinions, someone who might be able to lend a hand with free advice. And they are also great to turn you towards great products or maybe other partners that can help answer some of your questions. And besides nonprofits, it's important to remember that you'll also need to know local design professionals and people such as contractors, architecture and interior designers and engineers to get some of your projects moving. And then there's always state and national partners in preservation as well. Be aware of these resources that can provide assistance, whether that is financial assistance programs, if it's advocacy tools, or just educational information. Lots of them make really great handouts that are good to utilize as well. So in terms of Main Street, Iowa design services, this is really a huge resource to you that sets you apart from other downtowns. Similar to other services that we have with Main Street, Iowa, our design services are available to you on an ongoing basis by request. We do offer trainings and workshops on a number of design-focused topics, such as design committee basics, signage, window displays, and other things like that. And we have a good set of design resources and educational materials, such as our statewide design guide and our tech note sheets, which the tech notes are 1 to 2 pagers on specific design topics that you can hand out to specific building owners when they have questions. And as many of you know, because we just went through this process, the MSI Challenge Grant is the funding opportunity that is specifically available to Main Street communities for brick and mortar projects. And new projects rounds typically open up around July 1st. So always be aware of that, have projects in mind, and be ready to jump on that when that is released for the next year. And lastly, we have design assistance, which is conceptual in nature and designed to get you off to a good start for building rehabilitation projects. So in terms of design services in general, I want to encourage you to reach out early on in the process of a project for design assistance. It's important that you try to gather as much information as you can about the project prior to filling out a design assistance form, which the link for the design assistance form is always available in the FYI. So be sure to look in your FYI for that. And you'll also need to know prior to filling that out when your owner is hoping to start work, so that there's adequate time for a site visit, as well as time then for us to prepare the drawings and the written guidance that you may need. And we also need to know the owner's plan for the building in terms of what its intended use will be. And we'll also need to know if they need exterior renderings only, or if they're hoping for an upper story apartment layout or something like that. And then know how to prepare for your visit. It's really helpful to have all of your historic photographs and that information collected up front, because oftentimes those are a huge driver in the design process. We don't want to get set on an idea and then find out later that we had something that contradicts what we were thinking, because we just didn't have that information up front. And if you're having an on-site visit, make sure that you're prepared for that, by having proper access to all the spaces that we'll need to look at. This might mean making sure that a person who has the key to all the spaces that we need to look at, or make sure that those spaces are unlocked prior to the visit. And this is often overlooked, but if you have a project that we need to go look at the roof for, make sure that there's a ladder or something that we will be able to use to access that roof space. Because if we can't go up on it, it becomes extremely difficult to make any recommendations from the ground. And if portions or all of the building is unlit, this is often the case in upper story spaces that are unoccupied. It's too dark to see anything. So make sure that there's flashlights available for all the attendees who will be there, or that they at least have some sort of light. And finally, as a quick reminder to you, design committees are there to support directors in your revitalization efforts on your main street. I think many times design committees end up focusing on whatever comes in front of them that year. And they're doing a lot of streetscape jobs, such as filling planters, which, although very important, there are also many other building specific things that they can be doing to help you out and really make a difference on your main street. So they should be helping update, or if you don't have one already, they should be helping to create building inventories and get that historical information together and in one place. They can also help and implement local incentive programs. If you have a local competition for challenge grant, for example, that is something that they should be actively helping you with, thinking about projects and getting those teed up so that you are ready when the application comes out. And they should also be able to make sure that downtown friendly development is legal and encouraged through your local ordinances. They can help follow up also with business owners after they have received design assistance, and just kind of check in and see where they're going with the project, if they're able to implement any of those suggestions that we have, or if there are any barriers to them in making those projects happen. And they can also help distribute resources that we have at Main Street, Iowa, such as those tech notes and specific information from the design guide. And of course, your design committee should be an instrumental part of creating public awareness, not only of your history, but of the good things going on in your districts through historic preservation and design education. So they can lead public tours, such as upper story housing tours or vacant space tours, and give presentations to the public, and create and deliver award programs as well. And they can also help you with applications for the building specific portions of the MSI awards and other award programs that might be applicable, such as Preservation Iowa Awards and things like that. And they can even lead or orchestrate workshops to demonstrate and encourage proper building maintenance. They can help reach out to local construction professionals and things like that to give little trainings to the building owners within your district on topics that might be really needed within your district. So that's all I have. And I'll end with our contact information for Maya Fiala Justin, who is our design coordinator, and then my information. But it's important to note that right now I am the primary contact as Maya is on maternity leave, but she'll be back in December, and then she will be the primary contact as we go into the new year in January. because I will go on maternity leave in January. So with that, I'll open it up to you now. Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions out loud, or you can also type them in the chat box, and I'll have Carol looking at the chat box as well.
While we wait for questions, Sarah, I've got a couple thoughts to share too. First of all, thanks. Great information. And I know a lot of programs through the course of the year have started maybe new grant programs or local grant programs. And I really would encourage all of you to share this presentation with anyone that's doing reviews for grants, because you want to make sure that you're funding projects that have good design. And if they have a solid base knowledge of what they're actually looking at, it really can help enhance the outcome that you get locally with the funds that you're providing. So that would be one thing that I would just mention. And Sarah had a really great slide there that rehab best practices. If anything, make sure that your design reviewers at least know the information on that slide. Any questions? Or general comments are welcome at this time too. Well,
No
Sarah,
questions.
you did a great job because
I covered everything.
thorough information. So, and I just do want to reiterate the reminder about the limited design services that will be happening through spring. Please plan accordingly, and also a really important component of that is managing the expectation of the property owners. So when you are talking about the design services, make sure that your property owners really understand the realities that our team is facing as far as turnaround time and that kind of thing. And a lot of the visits are going to be virtual, if possible, rather than those in-person visits. So please be mindful of that as well. Anything to add, Sarah, that I didn't miss, that I didn't include in my
that
recap?
that sounds great. Yeah. Thank you, Carol.
Right. Well, hey, everybody, I think if we don't have any questions, we're going to sign off a few minutes early today. I know everybody probably appreciates an extra 10 minutes to get something else done. So thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you all next, let's see, next month, I guess. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.